October 31st, 1962. Halloween night. While children trick-or-treat across Manhattan, a 45-year-old pianist walks into Columbia Records' legendary 30th Street studio, a converted Presbyterian church on the East Side. Thelonious Monk removes his trademark hat, sits at the piano, and prepares to record his first session for a major label. It has been a long journey to this moment. For most of the 1950s, Monk was brilliant and broke. A genius making albums that critics couldn't understand and audiences didn't buy. His previous label, Riverside Records, had bought out his contract from Prestige for just $108.27 for the man who would become the second most recorded jazz composer after Duke Ellington. But by 1962, something had shifted. Extended negotiations with Columbia, one of the big four American record labels, had finally concluded. Monk's relationship with Riverside had soured over disagreements about royalty payments. He hadn't recorded a studio album since 1959. 3 years of silence, 3 years of playing clubs, 3 years of waiting for the industry to catch up to what his peers already knew. Thelonious Monk was not just a jazz musician. He was a revolution in sound. The quartet that enters the studio with him has been together since 1960. Tenor saxophonist Charlie Rouse has been with Monk since 1959, learning to navigate the pianist's angular compositions with a fluidity that made the impossible sound natural. Bassist John Orr provides steady support. Drummer Frankie Dunlop adds light, swinging propulsion. They've played together so long they communicate almost telepathically, a necessity when playing music this complex. Producer Teo Macero sits in the control booth. The same man who would later produce Miles Davis's revolutionary Bitches Brew now faces a different challenge: capturing Monk's genius on tape for an audience that extends beyond dedicated jazz fans. Columbia's promotional machine could make Monk a household name. But first, they need to make an album. The 30th Street Studio's natural reverb, courtesy of its former life as a church, wraps around Monk's first notes. The recording is close-mic'd, immediate, honest. This will not be a naturally staged event, but something more intimate, a direct line into the mind of jazz's most enigmatic genius. Over the next week, across 4 recording sessions, Monk and his quartet will lay down 8 tracks. Only one will be a new composition. The rest are revisitations, old songs reimagined, re-recorded, polished to perfection. Some critics will later complain about the lack of new material. They will miss the point entirely. This album is not about breaking new ground. It's about finally being heard. To understand what Thelonious Monk brought into that Columbia studio, you need to go back to the beginning, back to Minton's Playhouse in Harlem during the early 1940s, back to the after-hours cutting contests where the future of jazz was being invented in real time. Thelonious Monk was born on October 10, 1917, in Rocky Mount, North Carolina. His family moved to Manhattan when he was 4 years old, settling into the vibrant neighborhood that would shape modern music. Monk started playing piano at age 6, learning by ear before receiving formal instruction. His influences ranged from stride piano masters like James P. Johnson and Duke Ellington to the dissonant harmonies of modern classical composers. But Monk didn't just absorb these influences. He transformed them. By the time he became the house pianist at Minton's Playhouse, he was developing a style that would change music forever. His playing was percussive, angular, filled with unexpected pauses and dissonant harmonies. He attacked each note fresh rather than striving for legato smoothness. Where other pianists flowed, Monk punctuated. Mary Lou Williams, the legendary pianist and arranger who mentored Monk during this period, watched the birth of bebop firsthand. She observed the fast-swinging, sped-up tempos and extended solos being created, with Monk at the center. Years later, she would say that the Boppers worked out a music that was hard to steal, creating something so complex that only the most dedicated musicians could master it. Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, Kenny Clarke, Charlie Christian, these names became synonymous with bebop. But Monk was the architect, the one teaching them the songs and the chords. As Monk himself put it in a 1965 interview, they were about the fastest thinking musicians, and so they would come and play all the time, and I would teach them the songs, and the chords. They didn't just hear it. I had to tell them what it was. Yet for all his influence, Monk spent most of his career in obscurity. His first recordings for Blue Note between 1947 and 1952 showcased his unique style but reached limited audiences. A brief stint with Prestige yielded classics like Bag's Groove, recorded with Miles Davis in 1954. But commercial success remained elusive. The music was too difficult, too angular, too strange for mainstream acceptance. Even worse, personal tragedy struck. In 1951, Monk's cabaret card, essentially a license to perform in New York City clubs, was revoked after he was arrested with Bud Powell, and drugs were found in their car. Monk took the fall to protect his friend. For 6 years, he was banned from performing in the very clubs where his music belonged. The Riverside years from 1955 to 1961 brought both artistic triumph and commercial frustration. Albums like Brilliant Corners and Thelonious himself are now considered masterpieces, featuring collaborations with Sonny Rollins and John Coltrane. But at the time, they sold poorly. Critics praised Monk's originality while simultaneously describing his music as difficult and inaccessible. The final straw came over money. Disagreements about royalty payments soured Monk's relationship with Riverside. After his last studio album for them in 1959, the label released only live recordings from European tours. By 1962, Monk was ready for something different. He was ready for Columbia. Columbia Records in 1962 was a different beast entirely from the small jazz labels Monk had known. This was one of the Big Four, alongside RCA Victor, Capitol, and Decca, with the promotional resources to turn niche artists into mainstream successes. They had done it with Miles Davis. They had done it with Dave Brubeck, whose Time Out album had become a crossover phenomenon. Now they wanted to do it with Monk. The negotiations were extended, complex. Columbia knew they were signing a genius, but they also knew the challenges. Monk's music required careful presentation. His personality was enigmatic. He had a habit of stopping mid-performance to stand and dance while his musicians continued playing, a quirk that delighted some audiences and confused others. But Columbia saw something others had missed. Underneath the eccentricity was an artist whose time had finally come. The jazz audience was maturing, expanding. What seemed difficult in 1952 might sound revelatory in 1963. All Monk needed was the right platform. Teo Macero, the producer assigned to Monk's debut, understood this instinctively. Macero was himself a saxophonist and composer, a graduate of Juilliard who had co-founded Charles Mingus's Jazz Composers Workshop. He had signed Mingus, Monk, and Charlie Bird to Columbia, and he would later produce Miles Davis's most experimental work. Macero knew how to capture innovation on tape. The choice of material for Monk's Dream was deliberate. Rather than pressure Monk to write new compositions, Macero suggested revisiting older works. This served multiple purposes. It gave Monk's quartet a chance to showcase pieces they had been performing live for years. It introduced these compositions to audiences who had never heard them, and it allowed the music to speak for itself without the distraction of unfamiliarity. Only Bright Mississippi, built on the chord changes of Sweet Georgia Brown, was truly new, having been previously recorded only once in a live setting. Everything else came from Monk's back catalog. Monk's Dream itself was first recorded in 1952. Bolivar Blues appeared on his 1957 Riverside album, Brilliant Corners, and 5-spot blues came from the legendary 1958 live recording at the 5-Spot Cafe. The recording sessions began on October 31st and continued on November 1st, 2nd, and 6th. 4 sessions in just over a week, more sessions than many jazz albums received at the time, evidence of Columbia's commitment to getting the sound right. Engineers Frank Lyko and Fred Plout handled the technical side, using the 30th Street Studio's natural acoustics to create a warm, spacious sound. The studio itself was legendary. Originally the Church of the Holy Redeemer, the space had been converted by Columbia in 1949. Its high ceilings and natural reverb made it ideal for jazz recordings. Miles Davis had recorded Kind of Blue there just 3 years earlier. Now it would capture Monk's angular genius. The quartet's chemistry was evident from the first takes. Rouse's tenor saxophone provided the perfect counterpoint to Monk's piano, warm where Monk was percussive, flowing where Monk was angular. Ore's bass laid down solid foundations. Dunlop's drums swung with understated elegance. Together they made Monk's complex compositions sound almost easy. But nothing about this music was easy. Take Monk's Dream, the title track. The composition revolves around a simple, repetitive motif in C that borders on a drone. Monk's minimalist approach emphasizes unusual rhythmic hesitations and variations. The piece required dozens of takes. The 8th one was finally chosen, because getting that exact balance of simplicity and sophistication demanded perfection. If Monk was jazz's enigmatic genius, Charlie Rouse was its unsung hero. Their 11-year collaboration from 1959 to 1970 would become one of the most important partnerships in jazz history. Yet Rouse spent much of that time being taken for granted, overshadowed by Monk's towering personality and the memories of previous collaborators like John Coltrane and Sonny Rollins. Charlie Rouse was born on April 6, 1924, in Washington, D.C. By the time he joined Monk's quartet, he had already logged impressive credentials, playing with Billy Eckstine's orchestra, Dizzy Gillespie's big band, Duke Ellington's orchestra, and Count Basie's octet. He had recorded with Tad Dameron, worked with Clifford Brown, and spent time with Oscar Pettiford's sextet. He was a seasoned professional with a distinctive tone and fluid bebop-oriented style. What made Rouse special wasn't flashiness, it was understanding. Where Coltrane had overwhelmed Monk's music with his own searching intensity, Rouse complemented it. His clipped, emotionally direct phrasing matched Monk's angular compositions perfectly. His dry but luxuriant tone provided warmth without sacrificing edge. Most importantly, Rouse had studied Monk's music deeply enough to anticipate the pianist's unpredictable moves. Monk trusted Rouse completely. During performances, Monk would often rise from the piano bench during Rouse's solos and dance around the stage. A terpsichorean display that was as much a part of the music as the notes themselves. He could do this because he knew Rouse would keep Monk's stylistic flame alive, navigating the complex changes with quiet, steady grace. On Monk's Dream, Rouse's contributions are essential. Listen to Body and Soul, where his tender interpretation of the standard showcases his ballad playing, or Bright Mississippi, where his fluid lines transform the up-tempo swinger into something both familiar and completely new. His solo on Bye Ya demonstrates his ability to restate melodies while adding his own formulaic bop runs. Critics often compared Rouse unfavorably to Coltrane or Rollins, both certified geniuses in their own right. But this comparison missed the point. Rouse wasn't trying to be a genius. He was trying to be the perfect complement to Monk's music, and in this, he succeeded brilliantly. As one critic later wrote, Monk was so trusted Rouse with keeping his stylistic flame alive that he felt free to rise from the piano bench during the tenor solos. The rhythm section completed the quartet's telepathic connection. John Orr, on bass, had been with Monk since 1959. developing an intuitive sense of when to push and when to lay back. Frankie Dunlop, who joined in 1960, brought a lighter touch than previous Monk drummers, more subdued and supportive, giving space for Monk and Rouse's interplay to breathe. Together, these four musicians represented the kind of stable lineup Monk had rarely enjoyed. Most of his career had been marked by constantly changing personnel, different sidemen on almost every recording, but this quartet had been performing together for 2 years by the time they entered Columbia's studio. They knew each other's tendencies, anticipated each other's moves, finished each other's musical sentences. The result is audible throughout Monk's Dream. There's a cohesion here, a sense of four musicians thinking as one, that elevates even the familiar material. These aren't just re-recordings, they're reimaginings, informed by years of live performance and mutual understanding. The 8 tracks on Monk's Dream were carefully sequenced to showcase different facets of Monk's artistry. Side A opens with the title track, 6 minutes and 26 seconds of Monk's minimalist genius, that hypnotic drone-like motif establishing the album's tone immediately. Body and Soul follows, a standard that Monk transforms into something entirely his own. His reharmonization of the jazz classic strips away sentimentality, revealing the song's architectural beauty. At 4 minutes and 29 seconds, it's one of the album's shorter tracks, but it demonstrates Monk's gift for taking familiar material and making it strange again, or perhaps revealing the strangeness that was always there. Bright Mississippi is the album's centerpiece, clocking in at 8 minutes and 34 seconds. Built on the changes of Sweet Georgia Brown, Monk transforms the cheerful standard into an up-tempo blues that swings hard. This is the only track truly new to Monk's recorded catalog, and it shows that even in 1962, even while revisiting old material, Monk's compositional powers remained sharp. 5-Spot Blues closes side A with just over 3 minutes of straight-ahead blues. The title references the 5-Spot Cafe, where Monk had played his legendary residency with John Coltrane in 1957. A 6-month engagement that represented his belated breakthrough to wider recognition. The tune had appeared on the live album Misterioso, but here it receives a studio treatment that highlights the quartet's tight interplay. Side B begins with Bolivar Blues, or as Monk originally titled it, Baloo Bolivar Blues R. 7.5 minutes of Monk's playful approach to the blues form. The composition had appeared on Brilliant Corners in 1957, where it featured Sonny Rollins. This version, with Rouse, demonstrates how Monk's music could adapt to different interpreters while retaining its essential character. Just a Gigolo is the album's breather, a mere 2 minutes and 29 seconds of Monk taking on another standard. His approach is almost tender here. His percussive attack softened just enough to let the melody shine through. It's a reminder that for all his reputation for difficulty, Monk could also be remarkably direct. Baya stretches to 6 minutes, revisiting a Monk composition first recorded for Prestige 10 years earlier. The title alone, Monk's playful abbreviation for goodbye, captures his sense of humor. The performance captures his quartet at their most relaxed, swinging hard without forcing anything. The album closes with Sweet and Lovely, nearly 8 minutes of Monk transforming a pop standard into something distinctly his own. Like Body and Soul, Monk's reharmonization reveals unexpected depths in familiar material. His angular approach to the melody, combined with Rouse's warm tone, creates a beautiful tension that defines the album as a whole. Throughout all 8 tracks, the recording quality is exceptional. The 30th Street Studio's natural acoustics provide warmth and space. The close miking captures every detail of Monk's percussive attack, every nuance of Rouse's tone, the woody resonance of Ore's bass, and the crisp snap of Dunlop's drums. This is not the muddy sound that plagued some earlier Monk recordings. This is crystal clear, immediate, Professional. Columbia released Monk's Dream in January 1963, available in both mono, catalog number CL 1965, and stereo CS 8765 formats. The back cover featured enthusiastic endorsements from jazz authorities: Willis Conover, Ralph J. Gleason, Nat Hentoff, Martin Williams, and producer Teo Matero. Williams called Monk the first great jazz composer after Duke Ellington, an opinion that was by no means widely held at the time but would prove prescient. The promotional campaign was unprecedented for a Monk album. Columbia's resources allowed for advertising in mainstream publications, not just jazz magazines. Record stores received promotional materials. Radio programmers got advance copies. For the first time in his career, Monk was being marketed like a major artist rather than a niche curiosity. The critical response was overwhelmingly positive. In the March 14, 1963, issue of Downbeat magazine, critic Pete Welding awarded the album 5 stars, calling it a stunning reaffirmation of his powers as a performer and composer. He praised the cohesive interplay among Monk, Rouse, Orr, and Dunlop, noting how the quartet's years of playing together resulted in a nearly telepathic connection. Billboard described the record as provocative and filled with highly unusual bits and pieces that captured Monk's distinctive style. The magazine highlighted the quartet's takes on standards like body and soul for their melodic appeal and accessibility to broader audiences beyond dedicated jazz enthusiasts. But perhaps most importantly, regular listeners responded. Monk's Dream became the best-selling album of Monk's career, a commercial success that finally matched his artistic reputation. Jazz fans who had followed Monk since his Blue Note days celebrated seeing their hero get his due. New listeners, introduced to Monk through Columbia's promotional push, discovered a pianist unlike anyone they'd heard before. The album's success stemmed partly from perfect timing. By 1963, the jazz audience had matured. What seemed difficult or inaccessible in the 1950s now sounded like exactly what the music needed. Honesty, originality, a refusal to pander. Monk's angular melodies and dissonant harmonies no longer scared listeners. They intrigued them. Moreover, the album's mix of originals and standards provided multiple entry points. If Monk's Dream seemed too abstract, Body and Soul offered familiar moorings. If Bright Mississippi swung too hard, Just a Gigolo provided a gentler alternative. The sequencing gave the album a narrative arc, taking listeners on a journey through Monk's musical universe. Duke Ellington himself recognized Monk's genius. At the 1962 Newport Jazz Festival, just months before the Monk's Dream sessions, Monk appeared as a special guest with Ellington's orchestra. They played a spirited blues and a rousing Billy Strayhorn arrangement of Monk's Dream itself, with Ellington's full big band giving Monk's composition a completely different texture. It was a passing of the torch, one giant acknowledging another. The pinnacle came on February 28, 1964, when Thelonious Monk appeared on the cover of Time magazine. The portrait, painted by Boris Chaliapin, showed Monk in stark, dramatic style. Mysterious, intense, undeniably important. The accompanying article by Barry Farrell was titled "The Loneliest Monk." Being featured on Time's cover was a huge deal. Among jazz musicians, only Louis Armstrong and Dave Brubeck had previously received this honor. Armstrong's cover came in 1949, Brubeck's in 1954. Duke Ellington had been featured in 1956. After Monk, only Wynton Marsalis would join this exclusive club, appearing in 1990. Ironically, the article had originally been planned for late November 1963. 3 million copies were printed and ready to go. But on November 22nd, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, and Time shelved the story. Lyndon Johnson appeared on the cover instead. The Monk profile was rescheduled for February. The article itself sparked controversy. Some critics, including Leonard Feather, worried that Farrell's portrait of Monk as an eccentric genius reinforced stereotypes about black jazz musicians. Feather argued that jazz needed more respectable musicians on Time's cover, not crazy ones like Monk, though he acknowledged the article was well written and accurate. Ralph Gleason, the jazz critic in San Francisco, defended Farrell's piece, arguing it was one of the most honest and complete portraits of Monk ever published. The controversy revealed the cultural moment jazz was navigating, caught between the avant-garde movement, sometimes identified fairly or not with black nationalism, and older swing musicians seen as conservative. Monk embodied jazz's contradictions, revolutionary in his music, traditional in his suits and hats. The article included one particularly famous quote, contributed by a young Dutch journalist named Bert Vuijsje. During Monk's European tour, Vuijsje had been assigned to interview Monk for Time's correspondence. The interview was chaotic. Monk, famously laconic, gave mostly one-word answers to banal questions. But one exchange stuck. A radio interviewer asked, "Who has had the greatest influence on your playing, Mr. Monk?" Monk's response, "Well, me, of course." That quote, just 5 words, became the most famous and most often quoted part of the entire Time article. It captured everything essential about Monk: his self-knowledge, his refusal to play the game of false humility, his understanding that his music came from somewhere uniquely his own. The Time cover validated what musicians had known for years. Monk wasn't just another jazz pianist. He was an American original, an artist who had changed music without compromising his vision. The mainstream had finally caught up. Monk's dream was just the beginning. Over the next 6 years, Monk would record 8 studio albums for Columbia, along with numerous live recordings. Albums like Crisscross, also in 1963, It's Monk's Time, 1964, Solo Monk, 1965, and Underground, 1968, showcase different facets of his artistry: quartets, trios, big bands, and solo performances. Crisscross appeared in the charts in 1963, becoming Monk's sole LP to place on the pop charts during his lifetime, evidence of Columbia's promotional success. The album continued the pattern established by Monk's dream. Mostly revisited compositions played by the stable quartet, recorded with professional studio resources. The criticism that Monk wasn't composing enough new material during this period misses several important points. First, Monk had written approximately 70 compositions throughout his career, a relatively small output compared to Duke Ellington's 1,000+, yet Monk is the second most recorded jazz composer. Quality, not quantity, defined his approach. Second, the compositions Monk did write were so complex and multi-layered that they rewarded repeated performance. Each time Monk played Blue Monk or Round Midnight, he found something new in the material. His music wasn't designed to be played once and discarded. It was designed to be explored, inhabited, lived in. Third, the Columbia years allowed Monk to finally perform his music in optimal conditions. For too long, he had struggled with inadequate recording technology, insufficient rehearsal time, constantly changing personnel, and labels that couldn't afford proper promotion. At Columbia, working with producer Teo Macero and the stable Monk Quartet, he could finally realize his vision properly. The quartet's personnel changed slightly over the years. John Orr and Frankie Dunlop left in 1963. Larry Gales on bass and Ben Riley on drums joined in 1964. But Charlie Rouse remained constant from 1959 to 1970. Providing the continuity that allowed Monk's music to evolve gradually, rather than lurching between different sounds. Monk's live performances during this period were legendary. The quartet toured extensively, across the United States, through Europe, to Japan. Recordings from Tokyo in 1963, Paris in 1964, and San Francisco's Jazz Workshop captured the quartet's road-tested telepathy. These weren't studio performances. They were living, breathing documents of jazz at its highest level. Yet beneath the success, challenges were building. The late 1960s saw massive changes in popular music. Rock was ascendant. Jazz fusion was emerging. Columbia, like all major labels, felt pressure to chase trends. There were discussions, ill-conceived, thankfully unrealized, about pairing Monk with rock musicians, trying to create a Monk rock fusion album. Monk resisted. His music was his music, and he wasn't interested in compromising for commercial considerations. This principled stance would eventually cost him his relationship with Columbia, but it preserved his artistic integrity. The music he made during the Columbia years stands as testament to what happens when a genius is finally given the resources to realize his vision without interference. Monk's Dream occupies a unique place in Monk's discography and in jazz history. It's not considered his most artistically adventurous album. That distinction might belong to Brilliant Corners or Thelonious himself. It's not his most commercially successful by modern standards, but it represents something equally important, the moment when artistic genius and mainstream recognition finally aligned. The album's influence rippled outward in multiple directions. For established jazz musicians, it confirmed what they had always known. Monk was essential. Pianist Tommy Flanagan, saxophonist Johnny Griffin, and countless others continued exploring Monk's compositions, finding new interpretations, keeping the music alive. For emerging musicians, Monk's Dream provided a gateway. Young pianists studying at music schools discovered that Monk's seemingly simple compositions contained hidden complexities. His use of space, his dissonant harmonies, his rhythmic innovations, all provided lessons that transcended jazz. Classical composers began paying attention. Rock musicians, particularly those interested in musical sophistication, studied Monk's approach. The album also established a template for how major labels could market jazz to mainstream audiences without dumbing down the music. Columbia's success with Monk's Dream proved that honest, uncompromising artistry could find a wide audience if presented properly. This lesson would influence how jazz was produced and promoted for decades to come. Contemporary musicians continue citing Monk as a foundational influence. John Batiste, Ethan Iverson, Jason Moran, Vijay Iyer, and Kamasi Washington all have acknowledged Monk's irreplaceable role in their musical development. As Washington put it in an interview, "If you're a jazz musician and you think you're not influenced by Thelonious Monk, either you're not a jazz musician or you are influenced by Thelonious Monk." The Thelonious Monk Institute of Jazz, established in 1986 by the Monk family and Maria Fisher, has continued spreading Monk's legacy through education. The institute offers public school-based jazz education programs globally, helping students develop creativity, curiosity, and respect for cultural heritage. It hosts an annual international jazz competition and helped designate April 30, 2012, as the first annual International Jazz Day through UNESCO. Monk's compositions remain staples of the jazz repertoire. Round Midnight is the most recorded jazz standard composed by a single artist, with hundreds of versions spanning multiple generations. Blue Monk. Straight, no chaser. Well, you needn't. These tunes are learned by jazz students worldwide, performed at festivals, recorded by artists in every genre. In 1993, Monk received the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. In 2006, he was awarded a special Pulitzer Prize for a body of distinguished and innovative musical composition that has had a significant and enduring impact on the evolution of jazz. The U.S. Postal Service issued a Thelonious Monk stamp, the same government that had once issued a restraining order against Riverside Records for creating imaginary Monk postage stamps to promote a 1956 album. By the mid-1970s, Thelonious Monk had largely disappeared from the jazz scene. His final studio recordings came in November 1971 for the English Black Lion label, captured during a worldwide tour with the Giants of Jazz, a group featuring Dizzy Gillespie, Kai Winding, Sonny Stitt, Al McKibben, and Art Blakey. After that, just occasional appearances at Lincoln Center or Carnegie Hall. Monk spent his final years in seclusion, cared for by his wife Nellie and longtime friend Baroness Pannonica de Königswarter. He died on February 17, 1982, from a stroke. He was 64 years old. The jazz world mourned, but many felt Monk had never received full recognition during his lifetime. They were both right and wrong. Monk never achieved the popular fame of Armstrong or Ellington. He never sold millions of records or became a household name beyond jazz circles. But among musicians, the people who mattered most to him, Monk's status was secure long before his death. He had changed how musicians thought about harmony, rhythm, and melody. He had proven that individuality mattered more than accessibility. Monk's Dream represents the high-water mark of Monk's commercial success, but more importantly, it captures a crucial transition moment. The album documents what happens when an artist who has spent decades in the wilderness finally gets the support they deserve. It's not about selling out or compromising. Monk's music on Monk's Dream is as uncompromising as anything he recorded for Blue Note or Riverside. It's about finally having the resources to present that uncompromising vision properly. The album teaches several lessons that extend beyond jazz. First, commercial success and artistic integrity aren't mutually exclusive. Monk didn't change his music for Columbia. Columbia changed how they presented Monk's music. Second, timing matters. The same music that seemed difficult in 1952 sounded essential in 1963 because audiences had evolved. Third, the right collaborators are essential. Monk's quartet, especially his 11-year partnership with Charlie Rouse, provided the stable foundation that allowed his genius to flourish. Most importantly, Monk's Dream reminds us that honesty in art matters more than accessibility. Monk never tried to make his music easier or more palatable. He played what he heard in his head, regardless of whether audiences understood it. That refusal to compromise, combined with Columbia's decision to support him on his own terms, resulted in an album that brought Monk his largest audience without diluting his artistic vision. Listen to Monk's Dream today, more than 60 years after its release, and it still sounds fresh. The angular melodies still surprise. The dissonant harmonies still challenge. The telepathic interplay between Monk and his quartet still amazes. The album hasn't aged because Monk never chased trends. He created his own sound, his own logic, his own musical universe. In the end, that's what Monk's Dream really documents. Not just 8 tracks of brilliant jazz, but the sound of an artist finally being heard on his own terms. Thelonious Monk didn't need to change for the world. The world just needed to catch up to Thelonious Monk. And on that Halloween night in 1962, when Monk sat down at the piano in Columbia's 30th Street studio, the world was finally ready to listen.